Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Discovery Garden webinar series. Here at Discovery Garden, we know that starting a digital repository or archive can be a daunting task, as it begins with the question, how does my organization or collective get to that happy state where budget, timeline, and stakeholder needs coexist? Here at Discovery Garden, we have helped countless organizations from around the world plan, develop, and implement world-class digital repositories. Critical to success is to know where and how to begin the process. After working with more than 100 organizations and thousands of use cases, we can provide guidance on this first leg of your digital repository journey. This month, we are pleased to welcome Stephen Perkins, Solution Architect and Project Manager at Discovery Garden. Stephen has 26 years of experience directing small to medium to large-scale IT projects and specializes in digital asset management solutions. As always, we are going to be recording this webinar, and I'll send a link to access it later on today. Please mute your mics for the duration of this session to eliminate background noise. When we reach the questions portion, please type your inquiry in the chat window and Stephen and I will read it out loud. With that being said, we're going to jump right into the main presentation today, as I know that Stephen has a lot of very useful information to cover. I'm really looking forward to this one, and I hope you are too. So welcome, Stephen.
Good day, everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your days to come and talk about a topic near and dear to my heart, getting started with digital repositories. This will be a little bit different today. Most of our presentations tend to be slightly more interactive than this will be. But success in this area depends on planning. Making good decisions requires good information. So today's discussion is really going to be a lot about a process that we take you through. And there's a fair amount of preliminary assembly of information and tasks that actually go before building a start of a repository. So we're going to walk through some of those and then get to the steps of actually completing the work. So the milestones and activities that we're going to see today can be reorganized based on each unique situation. You may be coming from a place where you're building a completely new system from scratch. You might be migrating from an existing digital repository technology into Islandora. You might be doing a technology consolidation. But the steps hold, and on the way through, I'll try and give a bit of perspective from each one of those and the variations that might ensue. Yeah, there's only 50 easy steps, so I'll move along through these slides fairly quick. We're going to go through a series of milestones. The first is going to be identity and team building, and the shorthand for that is defining who you are and what you're about. And that's going to be followed by looking at where it is you are currently at, where you want to be, how you're going to get from where you're at to where you want to be, looking at any people you need to support you in that process and how to select technology and service providers, and then finally getting on with the good part of creating your digital repository. So a bit about how this whole step is going to work. Basically, I took a process definition and broke it down into a more simple set of steps. So we're going to look at everything in milestones. And a milestone is just going to be a significant phase in the process. So those previous half a dozen items where we define who we are organizationally and where we're at, where we're going to be, these are the milestones that we're going to walk through. Each milestone is going to have a set of activities that we perform as a part of that. And then we're going to talk about different types of participants. These are the people who are going to be responsible for these activities. So for our participants, generally there's a repository owner. And by a repository owner, I mean generally that's an organization. So that may be a university, a library, a museum, historical society. And then we've also got technology service providers, and there may be multiple people in your picture. There may be current technology service providers, prospective ones, or a selected vendor that you choose to work with in your digital repository implementation. And the participants may have different roles. So within the people that are involved in this task, there's going to be content contributors, content consumers, you'll have funders, subject matter experts, and those might be internal to your organization or external subject matter experts that you bring in. Sometimes you'll hear me refer to them as SMEs or SME. Could be software developers, and again, those might be people that are internal to your organization. If you have an IT department that is active in your implementation, systems administrators, and project managers. On your own side, you'll have maybe a team lead that's working to manage the project as you do your implementation. And on any vendor support side, there will be people there that are managing your implementation. Now, the first milestone that we go through is identity and team building. So what I like to ask people to do, and a lot of this is a part of a process that we sometimes consult and help people work through, is to have a good understanding of who you are and what it is you're here to do. So I ask people to draft a statement about, well, what's your organizational name, what's your mission. And then we want to identify contributors to the repository. Now, a bit about, again, about how this works. You'll see underneath each activity, which will be these names on the left, there'll be a participant, and that's the business owner of this particular activity. That's who should be responsible for this. And we'll talk about how sometimes those responsibilities are collaborative or shared at a later point. So in this step, we're going to identify parties that should have access or contribute to the content. So you may have people doing scans or that are working with audio content to digitize it, catalogers that are recording metadata about it. You may have students that are actively contributing to the repository, maybe contributing thesis or actually helping with cataloging processes. Faculty, you may have collaborative partners. A lot of times now in this age, what's great about the technology is people can collaborate across boundaries. And you may have volunteers. I know I work a lot with people that have volunteers that are assisting them with doing things like cleaning up OCR document transcriptions, things of the like. But basically, you want to identify anybody that should have access and contribute content. And next, we want to identify who our consumers are. Anybody that should have access to search and view the content or consume it in any way. So this may be the general public, academic users, researchers, federated search providers. Maybe you want to hook up with DPLA and have, or DOCLC gateway, and be able to have an Open Archives initiative feed that lets you contribute and expose your content elsewhere. We found that to be a great generator of traffic. Or you maybe need to connect to other technology services. Remember that a consumer doesn't have to be a person or an organization, and it can actually be another software service as well. And you may have likely, if you're like everybody else, you'll have a mix of all these types of consumers. Next, you're going to want to identify your funding resources. Know what you have for a budget going in and quantify that. And make a note whether some of those are actually available funds, they're pending, or speculative, applying for grants. This information comes in handy down the road when you're making decisions around the prioritization of features. Next, you're going to want to assemble a team. Nobody gets this done alone. It's a big undertaking, but we just do it one activity at a time. So assemble a team for your project. Now, some organizations do choose a single team lead, but it's really not unusual for this to be a distributed role, sometimes based on subject area expertise or people's times that they have available, because most of the people that we're working with on a repository implementation have other things that they're responsible for. But do organize a team, get everybody's roles established, and give people responsibilities, and then create a communications plan. Make sure that you're meeting regularly, that you understand who should receive communications and what events should trigger those. It seems a simple thing, but sometimes a loss of momentum is due to bad communication or not enough. So once you've gone through your identity, you've got who you are, what you're supposed to do, you understand who your consumers are, you want to take a look at where are you now? We call this in consultant speak, that'll be current state definition. But really it's all about exactly where you're at. That's your baseline for where you want to move forward. And this is a part of that may be different depending upon where you're coming from. If you're coming from building a system from scratch, that's your particular scenario, then the answers to a lot of these questions may be pretty simple. But if you're deeply entrenched in several technologies, then it might be a little bit more complicated. The first thing to do is to define who you serve. So going back to those documents that you developed in the first step, identifying your contributors and consumers, document who your current systems serve, not who they will serve, who they serve right now. Then you want to document where you're at in terms of your infrastructure. And this will be done probably in conjunction with your current IT provider. This might be, you may have access to organizational resources. You may have another service provider that is providing your web hosting. But basically, you want to doc the information if you have a current digital asset management system. Where does it reside? Who's your service provider? What kind of server architecture are they using? Are there any content delivery services that you're using? Are you streaming media, for instance? If you're able to, it's really great if you can get information about the amount of disk space that you're consuming, what kind of traffic that you're handling, where it's coming from, and whether you're having any performance issues. A lot of times people moving from one platform to another have particular drivers, and this is where we start to identify what we call non-functional requirements. Next, you're going to create an inventory of the applications that you're using. And again, this might be done in conjunction with your current service provider, but only what you use. So you're going to document what you use to capture data, how you store it, what software you're using for managing it, what software you're using for cataloging it, searching it, and making it accessible to the public, if you happen to already have that set up. The next activity is to create an inventory of all your digital assets. So you're going to want to know, okay, how much disk space do this consume? How many objects? How many collections? What types of content do you have? And different MIME types. So content types, am I talking about books, historical documents with transcriptions, media files, photographs, all the different types of content. Everything you can know about your inventory is very helpful to have as a basis. Again, this is going to play into when we develop the requirements and needs that you have for moving forward to a better place. Once you've done that, and some of these activities, I'm running these steps in sequence, but obviously if you have a team, or even if you didn't, a lot of these tasks might run simultaneously to each other. And a lot of them have entanglement. In this activity, you're going to want to document the metadata standards that you are currently using. Not what you want to use, but what you currently have. And if you have any internal guidelines about how you're doing your cataloging or your transcriptions, it's really great to get a copy of those set aside for anybody that's going to help you out. Helps them to understand, your practices. This is something we call meta-knowledge. Getting towards last, but definitely not least, document who the human resources you have. So look at the different roles of the people that you have interacting with any existing processes that you have. Yes, I've got 2 catalogers. This is what they primarily do. I have people doing digitization. This is their workflow. So we want to know how many people that you have interacting sort of on the back end side of this. This is focused on content contributors at this point in time. Next, this is a little bit open-ended as to how you do it, but we like to get a functional survey. And what that means is document everything that your current system does. Again, not what it doesn't do. We're going to get to what you would like it to do that it doesn't do momentarily. Everything that it does in the way of storing and preserving assets, managing them, controlling access to them, how do you get content into your system, how do you do your cataloging, how do you create and update records, how does it allow you to search and discover your content, how does it deliver it for presentation, these types of things, and then, of course, how do you get your content out. So this is kind of a functional survey. Again, it provides a baseline of everything that you are able to do right now. I'm saying keep it simple for this activity. I'm not asking you to write, detailed functional requirements at this point in time, but we just need to know what it is you can do. It can be pretty plain English. So once you've completed those activities, you know where you're at. and we're ready to think about where do we want to be. So this is our future state definition. So now you go back to some of these. We're going to go back to some of these artifacts that you created in the prior milestone. So starting with a copy of that who you serve list, start to add any new users and roles you wish to serve with a new repository. An example of this might be if you're working at a sports hall of fame, maybe one of the people in the front office are interacting with potential funders or licensees have any access to the back end that houses your digital assets, and that might benefit them. So you'd add them and say, you know, we want something that gives the front office access so these people can serve this particular business requirement. Now we want to think about what we call non-functional needs. So these are things not that the software does, but that your infrastructure needs to perform. Our current, say for instance, you have a system that limits you the amount of space you have for storage, and you've got a lot of cataloging planned. You've got some big new collections coming in. Well, you want to think about how much storage space you need for that. If you think you're going to be ramping up on traffic and your current system just isn't cutting it in terms of performance, then you need to think about that. And again, to keep this simple, I'm going to say, you know, keep it simple and add business requirements to that. So you may have some business requirements such as, well, the solution has to be open source, whatever technology we use, or we need to have a future transition strategy, which is an entirely great question for people to ask. No technology lasts forever, right? I'm already doing a migration. That's why we're going through this set of activities. I might as well think about any future migrations I need to do and make it a requirement for any system I'm implementing now to ease the pathway to adopt new technology in the future. So at this point in time, on the left-hand side for the business owners of these activities, you'll see I'm introducing subject matter experts. And I have an external SME there with an asterisk. These are the points in time at which you may think about engaging an outside party to help you to assemble this information. So now we're going to talk about the functional needs of the future. Now this is really easy. If you're starting with a new system, it's all new and you need to write down. But if you have an existing system, this is probably where you're going to think a lot about what your pain points are, meaning the things I can't do now that would be really beneficial in helping us to serve our audience. So you'll take a copy of that functional survey that you had from your current state definition, and you'll start a worksheet to add in functional needs and highlight anything you don't currently have. And when you're doing this, I want you to start thinking about priorities. What is it I really need? We use something called Moscow for this, which makes it fairly easy. It's just must, should, could, won't. And won't's a handy thing to have too. Just says, this is out of scope. I don't need to worry about it. Anything must, that's just a, you know, absolutely we can't function without it. Should, well, maybe in a later phase, that's good. If it does it out of the box, fantastic. Could is maybe something that's a lower priority. I find this to be a really easy way to go through. And don't worry about revisiting it in the future. As you juggle your budget and the prioritization of your needs will change along the way. Get something on the map. I urge you to maybe time box this task because you can always come back and change things as you get additional information. Now, we're going to think about the future in terms of your collections. So the next activity, you go back, you take that digital asset inventory that you got, create a copy, and start thinking about the inbound content that might be added to your repository or maybe is already planned. Hence that second paragraph where I'm saying, any projections that you're making on inbound content, note whether there's a degree of certainty. For sure this is coming, maybe it's coming, we don't know. It depends how this all turns out, or we're still discussing rights with someone. So that information lets you plan, and also if you have existing collections that you're still doing accessioning and cataloging of, try and quantify the amount of growth that you expect to see. You may have projects that are nearing completion. You may have projects that are just out of the ground. There's a lot of content incoming. We want to have this information so that you can plan an infrastructure that will be able to scale with your needs. And we're going to go back to revisit metadata standards in this next activity. So again, we've got that where we're at from our current state milestone, and you want to highlight any changes now that you want to make. Maybe you're coming out of a system that only supports Dublin Core, and you want to move to something that allows you to be a bit more descriptive. So you're going to say, yeah, we're going to migrate the content, but as a part of that process, we'd like to adopt a Library of Congress, metadata object description schema to go through. Or maybe you've got new standards in addition to existing ones. Yes, we've got everything cataloged in mods, but we'd really like to move to use PB Core for the media assets. So you're going to document all of these changes, if there are any. And also in a content, in a digital asset management system like Islandora, you may, because of functional requirements, need or want to maintain multiple metadata streams for a particular object. And if that's the case, then you want to think about that. For instance, if you're cataloging in mods and you need your repository that you're building needs to have an Open Archives Initiative feed, you're going to need to maintain a Dublin Core data stream for that as well. So these are all things you think of. Next, well, this needs to look great, right? So in this activity, what you're going to do is, sort of define what it is you're looking for. How is it I want to present all of my content? Now, today's webinar isn't designed to walk you through this completely, but I have included some points that you might want to consider. Do I have any branding collateral that we need to use or want to use? Are there any credits we need to give our funders or our organization? Do we have any existing organizational sites that we need to align with? Is there a specific ambiance? You can see the points on the screen. So these are the questions that I give people when I'm surveying them. There are more for sure, and as I said, that's kind of out of scope for today, but get some UI UX guidelines together. Back to the really all-important part, right? The people. So going back to a copy of your HR information from your current state milestone, add and highlight any additional resources that might come on board. Maybe one of the things you couldn't do, maybe you had a proprietary product that cost you per seat and it prevented you from adding sets of interns to help you with the cataloging work or transcription work. Well, now you're moving into an open source solution that's going to allow you to add these people. So you'll start to document who it is that's going to come on board that isn't already on board. At this point in time, for all of your resources, both already onboarded and planned for the future, it's really helpful to add sets of skills and skill levels to an artifact that you create for this. Like a spreadsheet works really well. That helps to identify what kinds of UI UX choices you might make for content contributors. So for instance, if you have infrequent users that contribute content, you probably want to have a more streamlined process that's very simple for them to add a few basic pieces of metadata and not have a clutter. Whereas a cataloger who does quite advanced and detailed annotation and metadata cataloging for the objects in the repository, they're going to want something more sophisticated for ingesting content and making updates to it. This information is really helpful for defining those requirements. Now, you need a timeline. So in this activity, I really urge people to maintain all the forward momentum they can. Focus on everything that is absolutely critical to what we call an MVP. Now, technically that's a minimum viable product, but I look at this and I say most value provided. This is the core requirements of what you need to get your repository up and running and moving forward. And really carefully eyeball what it is you can phase in following that MVP. So you're going to create a desired timeline that may or may not hold, but again, just get this done. Figure out when you need. Now, you may have a pressing deadline, in which case I urge you to select a vendor and get talking to them about that. So once you have your timeline, we've got everything we need to compare these two things. We know who we are, what we're about, where we're at, where we want to be, and now you can start making a plan to get from that current state to your future state. So the first part of this is to finalize what I call your needs documentation. I'm very carefully not calling these requirements, as the definition of that is pretty onerous. With this activity, I want you to produce a prioritized worksheet of your stated functional and non-functional and business needs. Now, the purpose this needs to serve is so that you can evaluate prospective repository platforms and service providers. Now you know exactly what it is you need. This is your litmus test. Does it have this? Does it have this? You can find this. And it also is going to allow you to start defining the deliverables for different phases of a repository implementation. Be under no illusion that everything will happen all at once in the first release of your repository. It probably won't. Plan for that now. So hence the warning underneath there to say, along with priorities, just make a marker. Does this need to be in my MVP? And really give that thought. Is it absolutely necessary? I'm not doing this to hold back functionality from you. I'm doing it so you maintain momentum. It's really surprising how effective this can be. In everything you do, include all your stakeholders. It's really important that everyone involved in the adoption and use of a digital repository, and this goes across organizations, if you're working with a consortium, needs to have participation in these processes. When everybody's voice is heard, the results are better, and the adoptions go much more smoothly. This is an optional step. And if you feel up to it, I urge you to give it a try. And this is where you may draft some use cases. Some of the things you want to do may be fairly straightforward. Well, I need to be able to edit metadata, and there's really nothing special we do. But you may have some other requirements that are unique to you. Maybe you want to watermark images, but you have multiple stakeholders and they have multiple watermarks and they need to be selected, and maybe they need to be based on particular accession numbers. Well, now we need some detailed information to be able to size up what it might take to implement these things. So if you can consider drafting use cases for functional needs. And we recommend something called Gherkin. Again, it's out of scope to give a Gherkin lesson here, but it's something that's fairly straightforward. It gives you 12 keywords to describe software behavior. And the emphasis here is on describing the behavior, not thinking about how that behavior is implemented. It allows you to build scenarios where we say, okay, given this, when this happens, this is how the system should react. That's it. So this is really useful, again, when you have something that's going to be sort of outside the normal realm of DAMS functionality, or you have complex use cases, or you have really specific workflows that might be unique to your organization. The more specific you can be when you're looking to do your estimating, the more helpful these will be in getting accurate costs. Next, we need to have a budget. So draft a budget that takes a few things into consideration. Now you know from your previous exercises, you know what are the really critical things that are going to deliver the most value. It's really rare that I think when people go with an MVP process that they end up with, say, less than 85% of all their really desired functionality in a first release. Are there going to be any future development or migration services that you require? Generally, establishing and implementing a digital repository is one project in what may be a chain of projects over time. It may be built because you know, well, in another 6 months, we're going to be ingesting another 500,000 pages of books, and we need this in place. It's not going to be in scope for the implementation of the repository, but you will need budget for work performed after that implementation. Or you may have future development that's not critical and you don't have budgets for now, but you want to know about these things. And then there's going to be ongoing expenses. If you're using a cloud-hosted service or a locally hosted service, if you have a hosting provider, then you'll need to plan an annual budget for that. And this is where all of those non-functional pieces of information that we got about the storage capacities you need and your throughput allow people to get these expenses. And then you're probably going to want some support. So without this and your timeline, it's impossible to plan. So, and I also don't recommend including speculative sources of funding. Always work with what it is that you have. Next up, the next activity is to define if you're involved in a migration, if you're coming from an existing system and you have data that you need to move from an older repository or software, or you're consolidating into a new digital repository, we need to know what constitutes success. Which collections are we going to migrate, and then are we going to be bringing over everything from those? Sometimes there are pieces of information that are critical to preserve in the migration. I make no judgment about those right now. I just know from having done this many times that you may or may not move all of the data. And that decision can have a cost impact, especially depending upon the age or capabilities or problems with your existing system. One of the things that migrations do is they generally take on the technical debt of the system that you are coming out of. And that can be difficult. So think carefully about what constitutes success. What is it that I need to bring over? And what is it that I may or may not care about migrating? So here's a good group exercise next. As an activity, you're going to start to prioritize and phase this. So you take that needs documentation that you've assembled and sort of try and finalize the prioritization. You've taken a stab at it along the way. Now's the time to sit down as a group and say, wow, this turned out to be a lot of stuff. What do we really need first? And again, this doesn't need to be perfect. As the realities of your budget and your timeline and new information is going to surface, guarantee you, it's still going to be, it's still going to be a dynamic document, but you should be getting pretty close to the next phase. So the next milestone here is looking at selecting a technology and service provider. And this is really who's going to support you in your mission. As I said with the other milestones, your situation may vary. These are just from experience sort of a set of guidelines as to how you can work through this. First, you're going to create either a request for a proposal or a request for information. I've left a little guidance as to which one is appropriate for your situation. And a request for proposal is good when you feel confident that all the information you've assembled is very complete and very detailed, and your project is funded, and you have some certainty that that funding will be sufficient, as much as you can before you start engaging an outside expert and actually building out the functionality. A request for information, this is good when, well, the funding's nebulous, we're still trying to size up this project, and whether we need to apply for any additional grants, that type of thing, or maybe there's gaps. Your group is building from scratch, maybe it has a little less experience than some, and you're saying, okay, I think I need information before we get more formal. So those are just a couple general litmus tests. Ensure when you put these together that it includes everything you put together in those prior activities, and give yourself a scoring process. You don't want to be sitting around saying, well, I liked these guys, they were good. Define a process that lets you objectively evaluate the responses that you get. That can be a grading system with some fudge factor for making decisions from your gut. And when this is complete, you're ready to get stuff out, almost. Any vendors that you're going to work with will need you to compile representative data samples. So assemble yourself a suite of data. This can be maybe anywhere between 10 and 20% of your actual information, and make sure that it includes a real cross-section of all the different content types that you have. If you've got multiple metadata standards that are implemented, you might have two different collections that are using two different metadata standards. Make sure that they're both included. And you can use internal expertise or your current IT provider to assist you with this. Once those has gone out, you're going to have prospective providers are going to respond to this request. And a lot of times there'll be a couple rounds of iterative exchange. People might ask for clarifications, additional data, that type of thing. Next activity will be to evaluate these responses. Take that process that you used for grading them in an objective fashion and apply it to the responses. And then the outcomes of these evaluations, and discussion from your team will be a selection of a technology and service provider that can help you. Go back and establish that timeline. Revisit your original timeline and compare it to what you have received. Was it realistic? Did I say this should just take 6 weeks and everybody that responded to me said, oh, it's definitely 10 to 12? Look at that, see if there's any deliverables you might shift around. And now we're on to the good stuff. We've gone through all this blurf about who we are, what we're about, where we're at, where we want to be, how we're going to get there, who's going to help us. And now you're ready to create a digital repository. These are roughly the steps that you will move through. For time's sake, I may summarize these. This will be recorded, and I think Adam can make the deck available to you. So I urge you to use it as a reference resource if you find it of value. Proper planning, and as I said back in the beginning, there's probably going to be 2 leads, one on your organizational side, and if you are employing a technology service provider, there should be a PM, as we call people such as myself, on their side. This is going to document how we're going to communicate, who's involved, exactly what it is we're doing. It's called our scope definition, how that work is going to be broken down into tasks, when they're going to be executed. We need to have a change process because it's not going to go according to plan. So you need to have a plan for when things don't go according to plan. How are we going to mitigate risks? If we were doing something existing, then we wouldn't need any help. So you talk about what the risks can be. So an example of what a risk might be is that things always come up in the source data when we're doing migrations. You need to have a plan for that. How are we going to test this? How are we going to say we have achieved success? There are ways to build tests for every piece of work being done. And then cutovers are really, really important. If you're building a new repository, not such a big deal. If you're coming from existing technology that projects are actively doing cataloging in, cutovers are really important. You want to minimize the downtime people have, and you want to maximize your efforts to get them trained and have them very comfortable and productive in any new technology that you are adopting. And then you need a closing criteria. When is this project done? Projects start and they end. As we say in the consulting industry, they are non-normative operations. You don't want to be trapped looping forever. It requires a good PM on both sides to push these things through and get to that finish line, and you will. First thing you'll do once you've had a kickoff meeting is you'll get your infrastructure provisioned. So this gets your server infrastructure that you need all set up, and that'll be provisioned. You might be doing this internally on your university's IT system, or you might having somebody setting it up in a third-party cloud provider such as AWS or Azure. Then your repository software gets installed. Your technology service provider will take care of this. So all the DAM software gets installed on a server infrastructure, and you can conflate these 2 activities that I just covered sometimes. If it's appropriate for you to use a software as a service option, that can be a very fast way of having your DAMs up and running very quick. At discoverygarden, we have a software as a service option. Islandora can be deployed online, and it's very, very quick to deploy and have you up and running. So remember back when we were doing our building our bridge, we assembled those the UI UX guidelines. Now we're going to use those to work with design staff and start to create wireframes. And generally there's a set of mockups that are created. Those get approved. And then after they're approved, a UI UX developer will code that up to implement the desired design in your repository software. And also that means implementing behaviors. When I say behaviors, maybe you want to have the ability to download files for people that have permissions, or you want to be able to print metadata out or to share on social media. So all of these behaviors are sort of a part of that code that gets written for the design. Next, if you have data that you're migrating or ingesting from another system, we have all that guidance that we assembled about what was essential to get over. We have the representative subsets that you've created, and now it's time for the developers to design and code a process that takes care of preparing everything to go into your new digital repository. You've seen the red print already. I've never received a perfect data set in 26 years, and something's going to come up. You're going to find things out about it. You're going to find edge cases you didn't know. Somebody did a search and replace that went bad, or maybe you had some catalogers 10 years ago that were less than terrific, or maybe particular subject vocabularies were not adhered to. All this stuff or parts of it will come up in your migration. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Your risk plan should include something for this. And it's always an opportunity when you are going from one system to another, or even if you're just taking a bunch of flat files off your desktop, this is a brand new repository, and getting them in. This is an opportunity to make your data the best it can be. Don't worry about it. So while the developers are busy coding up migration in this activity, this is where your software gets configured and customized. And we're going to need to know how to set up your roles and permissions, who can have access. Maybe your organization uses a proxy or has what we call an LDAP, a single sign-on capability. We will have talked about how people are going to search your data, what types of viewers you want to use for your presentation, how you want to update content, get it in, all of these features. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's sort of the heavy hitters that are always going to be in this MVP phase. When the migration process is ready, all of those representative subsets are taken and run through that migration process, and we put that in the repository. This is what we call the sandbox. And generally, this will roll out with a beta release as a chance for you, the clients, or the implementer of a digital repository, you may be doing this work internally, to review the results of that migration process. You're going to have a criteria for success. You developed it earlier, and now you're going to take that subset and look through and say, did everything come across? Did we not find something in the data that we should correct before we put it in? This type of thing. It can also be used for testing and training purposes. So for training, this is great. If you've got a sandbox that's live, this is the time to have your users and catalogs go in and interact with the forms where they'll be doing ingests and updates. And it's completely harmless. If they mess something up, no big deal. We're going to shovel out the sandbox before we put the live data in there. Before you go live with anything, you need to make sure your users have everything they need to work with your new digital asset management system. So again, heavy hitter list here. That's your current platform documentation. For Islandora, that's available right online. Links to any tutorials. You may find some YouTube materials or online blogs or materials that are great, that are applicable to your work. Links to community resources. Islandora has a fantastically active Google Groups that will get you answers right quick in a lot of cases. And any supplementary materials. You may have implemented some bespoke functionality that isn't standard in a particular system. You want to have that documented so your end users have a way to find out how to deal with it. Once you've done all these preceding activities, you're ready for a beta release. So now this will come out. It'll have almost a complete set of functionality, complete if you're really lucky, a couple of low priority items missing if you're not. This has your representative subset, and as a part of that release ceremony, depending upon who you're working with, this is something that we do at Discovery Gardens, it is an actual ceremony. And so the project manager does a complete walkthrough of all the functionality. We have all of the tasks that we agreed on, the desired outcomes, and so we'll walk through each one of those use cases to ensure that what you had in mind and what we defined was achieved. And then, of course, there's always some iterative feedback to be processed. This is what the beta is for. It's to flush out anything that isn't perfectly the way that you want it. We train the end users, and then off you go. And you usually have a time-boxed amount of time that you want to finish doing this evaluation. So the next activity will be your testing and refinement. As I said, again, you'll want to box this to 2 or 3 weeks. Have a team that you've selected to do your evaluation. do the review of all your test cases, and then the project managers should interact to communicate any feedback to the development team on what needs to be done to finalize your deliverables. Now, when all that iterative feedback and testing is completed, we've got what we call a final release candidate that's ready to be deployed. And this is really the exciting part, 49 slides later, where we follow that cutover plan that we made. How are we going to migrate from the old system to the new system in the production workflow and go live with your actual system? And now I think I'll turn it back over to, so we did talk about closing. Sorry, one more slide. There's usually a warranty period that you'll want to take. This is part of the closing process, but assuming that all of your software passes all of the test case and there are no defects in the migration, then at this point, the project is closed. It doesn't mean that you won't find anything wrong 2 weeks later when you go, oh, you know, we missed testing that form control when we were doing our review. There's usually a warranty from a good service provider that will cover that. But as I say, projects end. This is the exciting part. You go live, and it usually represents another beginning. So I'm going to turn this over to Adam, and I think he can open us up for any questions.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Stephen. That was certainly an absolute ton of very useful information that I know that our listeners and our viewers that we're going to share this with are going to take and use to put the groundwork in place to starting their digital repositories. So thank you very much for that presentation. As you mentioned, I'm going to open it up to any questions. Just let me know in the chat window if you'd like to ask a question to Stephen or I. I guess you covered everything, Stephen, as we anticipated. But if you're like us, if you're like me anyway, the moment I get off a call, I'll think of a question. We're only as far as an email away. So at any point, today, tomorrow, next week, shoot me an email. Shoot us an email at info@discoverygarden.ca, and we'll do our best to get an answer to you as quickly as possible. So once again, on behalf of everybody at Discovery Garden, thank you for joining us this month. And you can stay tuned for details on our next webinar in June. That will be released within the next coming weeks. So again, thank you very much, and thank you, Stephen. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.